So the problem with most practices and why I've actually had to shift the model of practice of architecture a few times is that they're too heads down in the doing. The current business model doesn't create a lot of space for that thinking. And if you are billing by the hour, you're actually reverse incentivized to take time away from that. Then we hold it up in our architectural history class. So we're teaching that like a non-usable building or a building that was only occupied for a short amount of time is the epitome of architecture. And then trying to say we're undervalued. But architects love to think that they have empathy.
Architects like to think they have empathy, but not for the developer's wallet.
Most Podern 팟캐스트.
Welcome to the Most Podern podcast. Evelyn Lee is the founder of Practice of Architecture, host of Practice Disrupted, a podcast, and a licensed architect who's built her career at the intersection of design, business, and tech. A former leader at Slack and Salesforce, she now works as a fractional COO and startup advisor, helping firms rethink how they operate and grow. Evelyn Lee, welcome to Most Podern.
Thank you for having me. So glad to be here.
Well, this podcast is really about how the built environment is shaped. And for many, the architect is still seen as the central figure in that process. But it seems that the image of the profession is often derived more by the popular idea of what an architect is, or maybe used to be, than by the reality of practice today. Yet here we are, Minkoo, Libo, yourself, me, all architects who have taken different paths through the profession. You've personally built a career helping others in the field lead with greater impact and navigate a changing world. So I want to start with this question. How do you personally define the role of the architect today?
I mean, that's an expansive question. And it could, the interesting thing, I almost want to flip this around too, because I've had intellectual conversations about, is it a profession? Like, is it a profession or is it a practice, or are we just talking about title here? Like, I think it's an expansive, and I think it's expansive in the best way possible. I'd be interested in hearing if all of you were told at one point or another, you can really do anything with your architecture degree. So if you take that to heart, then kind of the definition of what an architecture is and what architecture practice is limitless, right?
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that keeps on coming up. And if we just look at the four of us on the screen, we're doing totally different things. I mean, you're more consulting for practice, Libo's in tech, Minkoo's in development. I'm doing more design in academia, things like that. So there's a lot of things that one can do right now, no doubt. Mm-hmm. So I guess one question that we could then sort of move forward with is, generally speaking, how would you define, I guess, what practice has become? Let's say you deal with a whole bunch of different practices. So for the viewer out there or the listener who isn't necessarily an architect, maybe you can describe some of the things that people are up to right now.
Well, I mean, I think that depends. So I often talk about expanding traditional practice, and whether or not we have to continue to define what traditional practice is a whole nother conversation we can have later on if we want. But for me, traditional practice, and for the listeners, it's the taking a client through SD, DDs, CDs, construction documentation, and then, now architects try to get additional services on construction administration. Like, that's kind of the traditional box of what practice is. Delivering a building. I mean, more generally, what practice could be, and I think what it needs to be, and where architects need to expand their reach, is also kind of all the decisions that are made up to whether or not you even need a building, and then whether or not that building needs to be a ground up building and where that building needs to be located, to, on the other side, the caretaking and the longevity and the entire life cycle of the building. Architects talk about all the systems that we put in that help with the life cycle of the building, but then we step away from the project as soon as we hand over the keys, and we are never really the caretakers of our products. And I think that's a missed opportunity too.
What are some of the things that are happening more recently that are changing the way that traditional practice is being pursued?
Well, I don't know if, to be fair, a lot of architects are still very much in the realm of traditional practice. I think what is happening is, one, I think the world outside of architecture is realizing the talent that is coming out of architecture schools, and they're grabbing our workforce sooner in their career, frankly. I also think the workforce coming out of schools having had like one or two okay internships or even a really horrible internship experience. I talked to a lot more younger students who, after a summer or two, they decided, I'm going to finish my degree, but I'm not going to go into architecture. So I think there's pressure there. I also think there's outside pressure from venture capitalism and private, like VC and PE money, that see the AEC industry and our lack of progress in terms of new ways of working and even methods of construction as an opportunity to come in and create better efficiencies. So I see a lot more outside money being spent mostly on the C side of things, but there are definitely even some examples of ADU companies, for instance, in California that are driven by the tech guy who had a really hard time building the ADU in his backyard for his grandparents to live in, or his children, his parents, to create this multi-generational household. And that's essentially how Cottage got started.
Why do you think it makes it so difficult to be an architect these days? And probably that's most of the reason why the students are kind of thinking outside of the box now.
I mean, I think there are things the industry has become known for, especially for those who have suffered through sleepless nights in studio. And it starts, obviously, right, in studio culture. I still see YouTubes of younger or not even YouTubes, TikToks of younger creators in studio, like at the end of every semester or quarter, there's a whole new TikTok like on how many hours of sleep did you get the day of the crit, right? So I think there's that. I think one of the things that we're never taught, but simultaneously we don't seem to be interested in really improving our skills on, is kind of the project management and the business side of things. So what happens if you only learn from your managers that came before you, and they only learn from the managers that came before them, and nobody's really getting new ideas on better ways to manage projects. It's kind of this downward or, repeating cycle. And then you get stuck with people, that's when you get stuck in this cycle of being not compensated for the value that you think you should be compensated for, running up against tight deadlines, which means longer hours for your people, which means not so great like work-life balance. And you can say it's like this downward cycle, but it's one that we self-inflict upon ourselves for whatever reason. But I think that's essentially what a lot of people struggle with.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting how when I talk to my friends who aren't architects, they're surprised at how hard we work, how much we have to go to school, and how sometimes limited the profession can be. And I think we're starting to see that more and more with people sort of standing up and moving out into tech or moving out into other realms just to give themselves more possibilities. But as you speak through these examples, which are obviously very evident to anybody who's gone through architecture school, it makes me wonder, what was your experience becoming a trained architect and then transitioning out of architecture into something a little bit more sort of parallel?
Well, I think I suffered from a lot of the same things, right? So I have stories of me, like I always got sick towards the end of every semester. And I know why. There's no question as to why that happened.
3 hours of sleep isn't good for your immune system?
Yeah, lack of sleep, stress. I often, I don't know about you guys. I'm many years removed from school, but I actually can't remember how I got my work outside, like for my non-studio classes done leading up to, I don't know. I've just blocked that out completely. But then, and then I worked in I joined the workforce during a bit of a dip. It was a mini recession, call it. So I was doing like Home Depot cited apps. So if you joke about like the repetitive nature and the grind that students get put into, like the bathroom details, for instance, like those were the things I was doing on Home Depots. I was doing EFIS details on how can I make the outside facade of the Home Depot more special by shaping the EFIS.
There's probably a disconnect, right? Because you weren't doing that in school. And then you emerge and then you start doing a totally different task.
Yeah. And I think there's an interesting argument, right? The profession wants school to be taught one way, so people are better prepared for when they come into the field and they do different things. My take on it, though, is if we didn't go through that studio experience, which is different, by the way, as horrible, because for all the sleepless nights, I still really enjoyed my time in studio for other reasons. that type of experience is something that you don't get within other degree programs. So you could argue that that is key to what differentiates how architects think compared to any other degree program out there. So yes, it was different, but I would argue, I don't think it's necessarily the schools that need to change. I think it's the practice that needs to change.
Studio is something I think we always come back to when we talk to architects about what makes architecture schools so special. And I want to go back to something that you said about other industries kind of taking our talent. And I hope that's true. I hope other industries are looking at architects and saying, hey, like they're suffering over there. Maybe let's pluck some of them out. If you were to give the pitch to, hey, architects have this valuable training, the studio experience that can really be applied to your industry, what would that pitch look
like? So the other interesting thing is we talk about design thinking in architecture, right? And I think design thinking in general, even in business, is an overused term, it's overwrought. So the interesting thing is architects, though, are systems thinkers, and you're learning that actively in studio. It's site coming together with building, coming together with program. Those are the interesting things. So when you talk about transferable skills that students are learning immediate or like within the studio environment, I think is how to be a true systems thinker and think about all the different pieces that need to come together for building. Like even if it has that sky hook holding up that cantilever, there's still these other things that went into the building that they had to take on a lot of different attributes to consider when bringing that project together.
Yeah, and I think probably that systems thinking is the thing that's most sort of transferable across professions. And I think we're seeing that a lot as people migrate towards tech, where that's sort of thinking about the larger organization of your inputs yielding a specific output gets particularly applicable, maybe. I mean, Libo, you've definitely gone through that process, haven't you?
I say I hope that's true because a lot of times it does feel like I have to learn from zero to get to a manageable level to perform my job. But I do tend to agree with you, Evelyn. Like if you think about what are portable skills that someone kind of from undergrad gets, I feel like architecture gives you a nice blend of both kind of the thinking skills, but also the technical skills to implement. I think one of the skills that I really took away from studio that I still use is the ability to learn new things and to operate in them very quickly. I remember sophomore year, we are just told, oh, like you did hand drawing first year, second year, you're going to do digital production. Here's 9 different tools that you have to now learn and your plots are due on Friday, right? So it's also that kind of experience that we don't get eased into the tools that we're using in order to execute on the work that we are expected to output.
Yeah, I have actually never really thought about that, but I think that's a really interesting thing, and if you break it down in business terms, and people are using this lesser and lesser so, but it's like fail off, like go fast. Like the faster you can go, the faster you fail, the faster you'll get to the end, right? So in a way, it's almost like architects are kind of used to prototyping a lot of different things, and it's funny how you mentioned that you're always like building from zero, but like even in the studio culture. Like you said, I build from zero, but then you like also came back and said we were given all of these tools and said create a project around it. So I think inherently the ambiguity of that and using tools and making the connections too, right, between how you can leverage a different set of tools to come to drive to an outcome, I think is also unique, or I would think it's more unique than other degree programs.
Well, I think there's this aspect of learning by doing, which we all are absorbed and immersed in when we go into architecture school. And I think that that's maybe a little bit harder when you go into practice because you don't have the same agency or the same sort of bandwidth to just experiment with things. You suddenly need a client, you need to work with public agencies, you need to work with the developers, the community. And so it's a little bit harder to iterate there. Maybe that's one of the disconnects between transitioning from an academic environment where things are much more open to a professional environment where things are inherently more pressurized and closed.
Yeah, and I think you have to overlay the risk around that, right? Like architects are inherently, I would say, anti-risk averse. And rightfully so when it comes to health, safety, and welfare, and the whole reason why architects are licensed in the first place. One thing that I'm kind of encouraging architecture practices to do is find those moments for intervention to allow time to breathe and actually have create innovation. When I think about what I loved about school and what I love about just even being a professional out in the world is those moments of like learning and trying and succeeding or failing.
I mean, you talk to a lot of practices. Are there those out there that are actually experimenting and trying new ways of, I guess, expanding their horizons?
Yeah, I think there's definitely so the problem with most practices and why I've actually had to shift the model of practice of architecture a few times is that they're too heads down in the doing, right? The current business model doesn't create a lot of space for that thinking. And if you are billing by the hour, you are actually reverse incentivized to take time away from that. And I don't know most architecture practices, if you think about like how they want you to fill in your timesheet, you have to be, or how they measure the success of a partner or a different project manager, it's like you're 80%, 90% billable, right? So the time you're talking about is non-billable to a project. So how do you build a business that makes time for overhead? One, has the profit margins that allow you to incorporate that. Two, which I think we run, the poorly run firms don't have the profit margins to not have you be billable. And then three is just like then actually figuring out like what is the most constructive use of that time that can actually put the practice forward.
Yeah, I think we often compare it to like tech, right? Google has its, what do they call it, their moonshot projects, or you spend a certain amount of time working on things that aren't directly applied to your project, but are to give you the range of sort of thought that maybe would apply down the line. Is that simply because, tech has much higher margins, they're able to capitalize much more easily and just a more profitable business?
I think honestly, that's a lot. Google makes most of its money off of advertising, right? So it's hard to make it that direct comparison to like a service-based industry like architecture. But even if you go from like Slack or Salesforce, where I came from, it's product-based software as a service. That's also kind of hard to make like direct comparisons to the service industry. There are architecture firms that can afford to do that. There are architecture firms that do that. So Architects Fora actually adopted Google's kind of 4-day work week, 1-day research project model. And they've actually created a whole community engagement arm that is a separate revenue stream because it grew out of one of their employees' intention of how do we turn this into an additional business model. So there are, but they also have a very forward-thinking head of operations. That's one of the partners. So unless you have that type of individual on the leadership team, I don't really see it happening.
Well, I think you bring up an interesting dichotomy and something that's important to qualify architecture in the modern era, that architecture is still primarily a service-based profession. And I think there are a lot of architects out there who are trying to move more towards a product-based business model. You mentioned the ADU companies, for instance. That's one example. A lot of architects, we have one right here, have shifted to development, where your product is the building that you're creating. You hire the service people, the architects, to help you design it and assemble it. So I'm curious, maybe, Evelyn, what your thoughts, and also Minkoo as well, if there is room for architecture to move more towards product-based work.
I mean, yes, like I would say in terms of modularity. I mean, Minkoo, I'd love to hear from you because on the development side, but there's definitely, and here is VC and PE money coming into architecture again. There's definitely firms out there that are looking at like what is modular material, like what does modular materials look like that really drive the design. So when it comes to modularity, I think that's a huge opportunity. And then if you think about all the things you can do with 3D printing at scale now too, that's like that opens up a whole like scale, both as from a easily replicable, but scale as in we are 3D printing entire buildings now too. We definitely have the technologies and the means to shift that model a bit.
Yeah, I think the speed of production is the biggest challenge. The money is out there, as you mentioned, Evelyn. If it's a nice project, I'm sure there are private equity firms, probably not be VCs, who's willing to invest in these type of projects. However, because there's so many stakeholders involved in building a single building, as much as you can make the construction process shorter, I don't think there is a very clear way to make the other, like the prior processes, like the community engagement, zoning, and all that, to be much more efficient, because it's so damn hard to build like a 3-unit building even. So maybe the AEC industry's concern is more about the production, how to make it more efficient, and on larger project scale, it might be more effective. So I'm curious to ask you, Evelyn, whether you consulted any architecture firms, and in different scale and different sizes, and also related to the projects that they do you consult them differently?
It depends on what they bring me in for. So a lot of architecture firms just essentially bring me in for that I advise as an outside advisor, just bring me in for to get like to help them, look up from the page essentially and understand the broader landscape. So that's what I'm doing a lot of these days. But to that end, I think I do see a lot more architecture firms going actually, and I was looking up a few Minkoo while you were talking, like so Mighty Buildings out of Oakland. Libo, you're no longer in Oakland. Are you all East Coast based?
Back in New York, but
Yeah.
Alex is in SF.
I'm in San Francisco.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you know the Mighty Buildings story, Alex?
No, I haven't heard of them.
So Alex, so Mighty Buildings they started off 3D. So actually, it's one of my fellow Presidio graduate school degree program grads started off by 3D printing, not dissimilar from that Texas firm that's doing like the 3D printed neighborhoods, but they were essentially 3D printing ADUs.
Icon?
They're VC backed firm. Yeah, not like I would say Icon scaled, because they were like one of the first 3D printed building people out there. But their model has been interesting. So they've pivoted to panels. So when we talk about like modularity and what you're able to do there, and when we also talk about architects being hired away from architecture, they have a lot of architects kind of on staff figuring out like what can they do with these module pieces. And honestly, for a lot of these startups, it's like, what is the go-to-market strategy? You have all these tech like VC people that have never built buildings and are now like find themselves square in the AEC industry.
When we talk about architecture, we talk about the practice, but when we talk about architecture products, we talk about the building, right? And a lot of the things that go into the building product doesn't necessarily have to be architects. Like architects play a role in Mighty Buildings, but they're not direct hands-on product most of the time. So it seems like there's two branches emerging, like one where architects practice just what I'll call traditional architecture. Let's just say there's a bubble over here, and then a bubble over here of emerging tech startups and folks who've gone away from traditional architecture but are working in somewhat of a tech relevant architecture role. Is there something in the middle where it's a different business model within architecture, but it's not fully productizing buildings or doing modular, but something that's still very well within the image of an architect traditionally, let's say?
So there's a mass timber company out of Canada called Intelligent City, and I don't know if you guys have seen them, but what's interesting is actually I would say it's somewhat technology, but it's actually what they do is they provide the mass timber segments, and then they have a technology that sits on top of that. It's a company that was founded by two architects, and they have a lot of architects on staff, but then they also have a lot of software engineers on staff. They actually have like actual engineers on staff because it's engineered mass timber. And they're focused on housing. They sit at this very interesting intersection of, they still work with architecture firms, but they are providing this piece of this building, and it was founded by architects. So there's definitely some crossover and some mix of that happening. And they hire a lot of architects, but they also hire a lot of software engineers.
Perhaps that means that the architect is really the one in charge, or the domain of architecture is really about assembling things, how things come together and fit together. And whether you are the developer who's actually figuring out how the different consultants and all the different policies and the money fits together, or if you're actually on site and actually telling the contractor to move things from one place to another, there is an element of that systems thinking that you were talking about at the beginning, Evelyn, that goes into play. I think, Libo, to go back to your question, what people are worried about leaving is maybe the feeling that they don't have agency over space. I think that's probably what always gets us into architecture in the first place. The fact that we see tall buildings, we go to nice parks, we say, wow, I want to design that. And when you go into, I think, some of these more specialized offshoots of what architecture could be now, you maybe lose a little bit more of that. What do you guys think?
I think you lose a little bit more of that. I think if we go even back to studio culture, though, like it's like you can spot the architecture student from a mile away on campus, right? Like I think there's a
They're wearing
certain like
black. That's why.
architect as a lifestyle, right? That like in a way, when you talk about like the hardest thing when architects talk about transitioning from architecture and tech, honestly, is I was like, you have to let go of your architecture portfolio. You have to show them that you can build in, and it's like, it's an identity crisis at that point, right? Like, who am I without the portfolio of my design? So I think, yes, it's like space, but it's also like we inherently make it such like it's a profession, but it's also a lifestyle. And some people feel like how could I divorce myself from one or the other?
Is that healthy, by the way? I feel like it pushes you when you're a student. Like you really have to kind of be obsessed about it and go all in. But then as we see, there's also issues when it comes to profession, being able to separate your work from the rest of your life and, sort of the limitations that you're now bringing up, Evelyn.
I don't know if it's not like unhealthy, but it also depends. I think there are people like me who go into tech and say like, and kind of celebrate the fact that I am a building architect rather than a software architect. And I purposely maintain that identity of an architect, even though there are building architects that say what you do is not architecture anymore. I'm like, I have my license. People say like, you can't no one can take away your license except for other architects. Who don't believe you're doing architecture. So I think it like there's ways to maintain that identity. I just think one, we tend to not create space for individuals like the four of us in the room. So then you feel, and I definitely have felt this from the profession side, I am not an architect, right? So but that doesn't mean that me, myself as an individual can't continue to identify that. I just have to like not care about what
Right.
the other people think.
I feel like it's a bullet that you need to bite if you want to dip on both sides. You yourself also experience an identity crisis, right? Like at some point, if you're in a room of, for my example, if you're in a room of developers, weirdly they see me as an architect. And if I go in a room of architects, they see me as a developer, which is not a good thing.
You just have to change your glasses. Then you'll have a different persona.
Needs to be
I think that-
rounder, a little smaller.
But maybe that's where the verb practice comes into play, which is as you practice, you start to develop your own identity around your work, not necessarily about anything else. It's something you actually have quite a lot of control over. And, you also touch on an interesting phenomenon, Evelyn, which is tech's ability or sort of impulse to take nomenclature from architecture and apply it to their enterprises. And I think what that means in a way is that we spend a lot more time and resources developing digital spaces or developing spaces that aren't physical rather than the physical spaces that we used to inhabit only 30 years ago. I mean, we're recording this podcast from 4 different cities, but we're somehow in the same so-called space, so to speak. I think that's something too that to me, it seems it could be scary from the profession side, but it can also be quite optimistic because you could, as you mentioned before, take the same logics and the same training that you learned in architecture school and apply it to this new world.
Yeah. And it's if you talk to it's really interesting if you talk to some of especially the older generation of like software engineers, a lot of them have read Christopher Alexander's pattern language. Like, and they actually know it more so arguably than architects because they've built it into their coding, like the codex of like the products that they build. And architects are just like, like I don't like the symmetry of it's arguably, I feel like they've, in a way, adopted some of what Christopher Alexander has had to say more so than architects in a postmodern era has adopted like the learnings from Christopher Alexander. But the other thing, though, is and this can go back to a whole titling issue, right? I believe if we, Minkoo, if you can say I'm an architect doing X, Y, and Z, and if I can say I'm an architect working in tech, and Alex similarly, then people would actually have a greater understanding of like architects do more, and they are like they can think beyond buildings, and they bring a lot more value to the table than you ever did. But meanwhile, the title is held so sacred by the traditional practitioners that we, in and of itself, we kind of like limit our ability to talk more about those transitional skills and what we can do beyond.
Is it just because we left? Like, do lawyers deal with this problem? There's plenty of lawyers who don't practice law. They're in corporations doing law-related things, or they're just doing other things like being a software engineer. Like, do they come together and say, oh, like we've all had an identity crisis when we stopped becoming lawyers in practice?
I don't know. I don't know enough lawyers to answer that question.
It is interesting how it does seem as particular to architecture. I also can't put my finger on it. But I also wonder if it's a human impulse. I mean, like for instance, I teach students who come into urban design program. And the name of the program is Masters of Architecture in Urban Design. And a lot of them suddenly think that I'm no longer an architect, I'm an urban designer. I have to like figure out how to be an urban designer. I have to constantly remind them like, no, you're both, in fact. You are this and that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. For me, it goes back to like the whole lifestyle thing. So maybe Alex, from that standpoint, is like not a very healthy thing. I don't know.
Well, I think the architecture culture is quite intense, let's just say. And there is an image of the architect, and it's probably reified by certain circles within architecture. Although I do think that that's starting to shift a little bit just because of financial situation, the job market, opportunities that are available. I mean, just go back to the basic fact that you look at a city like San Francisco or like New York or Boston or whatever, there just aren't very many open lots. Like you can't build nearly as much as you could 30 years ago. And so I do think that there's other pressures that are causing different generations to rethink what it means to be an architect. And I think if we look at it that way, it's pretty positive, actually.
I see all the change that's happening, like either to the profession or within the profession as opportunity, honestly. I just think how we end up on the other side of all that change, whether or not it is going to depend on whether or not we take the bigger chunk of that opportunity or other individuals seek out that opportunity before we do.
So you talked earlier about how there's a lot of external forces coming in and trying to shape the industry without maybe the architect being in the driver's seat. From your perspective, who now has the power to shape the public image of the architect? And does that still rest within the hands of the architect, or have we lost space to startups and investors?
No, I mean, I think that power has always been within ourselves, but I think it's, again, I think it's in our ability to get out of our own way to talk about it, right? So do we, as architects, empower one another to go out and say, like, you should be able to call yourself an architect, go out there and like refer to yourself as an architect? And even do architects, I mean, let's call it out. Like, architects have a really hard time defining their value. You want to get paid for the value that you think you are worth, then you have to be able to clearly define what that value is. I had we can't rely on a big association to run a single marketing campaign and believe that like all the world's going to all of a sudden be like, man, that moved me. This is what I normally pay, but I think I should be paying 20% more for the same thing that that I've been paying for before. Like I can't, there's not a single marketing campaign that has ever moved me to want to pay more for something that I already pay for. So it's like, I think it's incumbent upon kind of the architects as individuals, but in terms of how we empower each other, both as individuals with architecture backgrounds to go out and talk about that, or disempower by saying, oh no, Minkoo, you're on the developers, like you're a developer now. Don't talk about how you're an architect. I think that does a disservice to architects.
Yeah, I'm curious because traditionally public images of certain professions were heavily shaped by movies and media. If we look at the latest movie, Brutalist, I think...
I have not seen it.
Oh, you haven't seen it.
Have you guys all seen it?
No, I watched it. I haven't
seen it yet.
But I wasn't impressed because of the rhetorical figure that they could to portray of this kind of herded creative, with visions only. And I think that's a very difficult proposition to make in these days. And, it's been a very traditional way of relying on awards or kind of your status among your peers and marketing that as, look how many awards I got, therefore my fees are a little higher than the others. Like, I think there should be a way to differentiate yourself more than that to make your life more easier and more effective.
Well, I think the single genius is it's a myth in architecture, and it's becoming more of a myth because buildings are just more complex. Like, you talked about the scale of building Minkoo and how it relates to someone's identity as an architect or not. Like, there's no single building that you can do by yourself these days. You're going to
No.
need to, even if you can construct it, you're going to need to have authorization from somebody else. And so the architect is much more of a conductor nowadays. They don't necessarily have to play the violin, but they need to know how the violin works with the flute, works with the brass, and see it all come together, I guess. And I think maybe going back to your point, Evelyn, that's why it's hard maybe to assign a particular value to things versus the star architects who can say, well, look, I designed this amazing building, I designed this airport, and tourism increased by this percent, versus the everyday architect has a much harder time establishing that.
Yeah. Yes. But I also think like we just, design awards are kind of representative of the fact that we like to talk about things from our perspective. And in order for others to understand the value that we're delivering, we have to really take the time to understand what they care about and then speak to the value from their perspective. And I think that's hard to do because we're out school, we're trained to defend and we're not necessarily trained to talk about how our work is meaningful to others through their lens of what they find most meaningful. Does that make sense?
But is there an avenue to do that?
I mean, yeah, every time you sit down with a potential client, there's an opportunity. I think you really have to understand the client, though. I was on the client side, essentially the developer side. Minkoo, like you're on the client side, right? Like I was on the client side, and I had dealt with architects who knew I was an architect, who between the weekly meeting, like didn't change the one thing that I really needed them to change because I don't know, architecture egoism, like the ego of the architect. And I was like, I'm the client and I'm the one with the money, and I know my people. So I know this is not, this is not how you designed it, but this is what we need. So I think like that in and of itself, to understand and adapt to the needs of the clients, let alone then talk about how what we are designing is of true value to them, I think is just hard.
So maybe more empathy, like understanding each other's needs a little bit better.
I know. Architects love to think that they have empathy.
Architects like to think they have empathy, but not for the developer's wallet, right?
That's the problem.
That's something that I feel like, especially in tech, there's a lot more of a culture of, is like justify the value before you go do the thing. Like a lot of the mistakes that I've made, I think in my shift to tech is in these situations is building the thing before we validate it, whether or not it's valuable to build. And it's this thing where if it's not being used, it's not valuable, right? Like it doesn't matter how much work you put into it. Yet the mindset that we come out of school with is like, it's back to that portfolio thing where it's this thing that gets more valuable the more stuff you like pack into it. And when you have 10 years of stuff, finally you'll be a valuable architect and you can like raise your fees.
Oh yeah. No, I think that's a really important point, because like you have to have a business case for anything on the tech side. So like if it doesn't have a business case, they're going to be like, nope, we pass on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, this may be a tangent, but I think a good example is the Osaka Expo that we're seeing now, and it's about to fail. And they're doing this, it's about to fail in terms of revenue, and there's a huge deficit in terms of how much they put into construct these very ambitious projects and the number of visitors, because that's the reality, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting because there was a period of time when architecture had a lot to spend. I mean, the last World Expo that I really thought about was 2010 Shanghai, and you had all these star architects building cool stuff back then. And it sort of continued throughout the decade where there was a lot of airports, a lot of big projects in Middle East and Asia. And, the other thing that just I think we all have to recognize is that architecture is highly influenced by macroeconomic changes in the world. When the interest rate grows up several bips, your project goes up. And I think that maybe it would benefit people to understand how that worked and take responsibility for it, even though if it's not your fault necessarily, but be able to adjust to that maybe. And I think that's why perhaps more people are getting interested in finance when it comes to architecture, going into development, trying to understand where the money is coming from potentially.
Yeah. I think architects would be smarter in the long run to just understand that cycle, because even the cycle of our projects are so long too. Like maybe if your project is over if you know it's going to take over 5 years, then maybe there's an overlay of economic data that you should put on that. It's like just saying like, here are the different reasons why what you're budgeted for right now isn't going to work for you. But we've never been able to talk in those terms.
Yeah, and I get that the current education is neglecting to include those education as part of the curriculum because reality is full of constraints and it's difficult to be creative by a very short period of time. So it may be a must. However, if you want to be a successful designer, I truly believe that you need to know where the other clients are coming from, where your constraints are coming from so that you can provide a creative solutions to that.
I would love to get your take though on the fact that, and this goes back from, I think, our role changing as like the master builder to more the coordinator. I think another place where I think we suffer is that we suffer because we don't rely as heavily on other expertise outside to inform some of our work, rather than, because Minkoo, this interests, I always like kind of have to like take a deep breath when somebody said like it wasn't included in our schooling, and I was like, yeah, but we already have 5 years of schooling. Well, like where do you want to, like, one, what do you want to take out of the curriculum? But two, it's just like, well, maybe if we were better in bringing people on our teams that can add that dimension, then we don't necessarily have to get that in school. And for whatever reason, I think architects are less inclined to listen to outside expertise from anyone on, one, how to run their business, two, especially if we think that they are stepping in our wheelhouse of buildings.
Yeah, I think that is a niche area that is quite demanding, and not most, but part of my work actually involves that type of communicator. When I work with the owners and I represent them, and I work for the development project and work with the architects, a lot of times I need to translate where the owners are coming from to the architects, for them to understand which parts are the parts that we can actually try to do some ambitious stuff and which parts are not. So those are based on numbers essentially, and the rates and the capital markets. How can this project be financed, so on and so forth. So it is a niche, and that's part of the education and class that I'm trying to implement at MIT too.
But Minkoo, do you think that role is necessary? Like having a foot in both circles, you understand that it's sometimes hard to translate finance to form, let's say. And I do think that sometimes having a separation between the two is healthy in that you can't focus on those two things simultaneously all the time. But at the same time, it does seem like we all are in agreement that it would be helpful for architects to be a little bit more financially literate. So
Right.
Where do you draw the line? What's the right balance?
I think the goal is the same. We share the same goal, truly. Like the owners, myself, the architects, we all want to have the building succeed. But we shouldn't be neglecting what's important for the others. So the owner isn't necessarily always motivated by enormous profit. And nowadays, those enormous profit days are almost gone because of the interest rates, because of the difficult investment environments in real estate. But buildings still get built because of the owner's will to build, and also because they care about the community as well. So what I do is I try to communicate through visuals, through numbers, through spreadsheets, what the owners are looking for, because they might lack that kind of visual communication skills, and what the architects might want to do here. So I think it's a good blend. And in a perfect world, if the architects can also be financially literate, probably I don't have to have my role, but I think it is important for the architects to know, and also the owners to know, where each other is coming from.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. But there's one word that you use, which I think is quite nebulous, which is success. Like, how do we define what is a successful building? And I think that's still way up in the air right now. And it could be a financial success. It could be design success, beautiful. It could be inclusive. It could be sustainable. There's all these different metrics that I think we're having trouble sort of deciding what is valuable, maybe.
Yeah, actually, if a project can do everything, that's the best.
Sure. Yes, agreed.
But I also think that, Alex, that goes back to like the difference. So architects would, they define success because we turn over the keys and we honestly like don't have a lot of touch points with that building afterwards by the number of design awards, right? Owners would probably define the success. Well, it also depends like on, like the occupants would define their success probably a little bit different. And then if you are not an occupant, but you are an owner, you define your success by, are the occupants happy? 1, 2, am I keeping my costs at a minimum, or am I like the ability to make a profit if I were to flip it. But it's also kind of, since we define our success solely based on the beauty of an object, that I think we then kind of are distancing ourselves from an opportunity to have a much deeper conversation about our value and what we brought to the table.
Yeah, I totally agree. I've been thinking a lot about how architects, as we're talking about awards and schools and things like that, often define good work based on the opinions of their peers. And if you think about the most lucrative businesses these days, they don't. And probably forever, it's always been the ones that are able to cash in and make really sustainable businesses are not based on the opinion of their peers. Nicholas Taleb talks about this, and he says a plumber doesn't go to other plumbers and say, like, look at my work, look how good it is. No, they simply go fix the toilet, and if it works again, the client will pay them. And I think that's a little bit of a difference between the developer and the architect. And I do think that as architecture becomes more and more pressurized, one should start to think about how we can define our success, not based on what other people think about it, what other architects think about it, but what the actual users think about it. I know, for instance, Libo, you are always asking me about post-occupancy studies, and it seems like that's one area that we never, I think, capitalize on enough.
That's really important. I can give you 2 very simple examples. Villa Savoy, Le Corbusier. You know what happened to the owners? Well, they got sick because the building was leaking water. And, architects still visit the site to study the elements, but it's unoccupied. So what is the value of that? And then there's another great building, Seagram Building by Mies. That building has been traded on the top dollar. It has been getting the top rents throughout the years. And even compared to the newer buildings, it's still valued very high. So we have very distinct 2 architectural masterpieces that I think, but their value is totally different based on who uses it and who continues to use it and who continues to pay to use it. So this is the reality that we need to deal with. And that's why I think for developers also, we care about the value of buildings, because the success of the building is actually very tied with the usage. And to have the building used well, it needs to be good and beautiful.
Yeah, you guys are in it for the long run. A lot of times if you're holding it, or if you're selling it right away even, or if you have to rent it out, like you have to make sure it works pretty well. Mm-hmm. Another good example is the Johnson Wax Tower in Wisconsin. I remember when I visited, they said they used it as a lab for a couple of years, and then they realized it wasn't really useful. So it just became a museum, essentially. It's a beautiful building, but it's just a bunch of architects who go there and check it out and say, wow, this is a cool building. But then the utility, it's not quite there yet.
I know, but then we hold it up in our architectural history class. So what are we? So we're teaching that like a non-usable building or a building that was only occupied for a short amount of time is the epitome of architecture.
And so maybe it does go to education.
We're undervalued. Well, yeah, and then try to say that we're undervalued. But here's a building by a well-known architect that.
Well, we're joined by.
You have a guest.
A future architect potentially.
Do you want your children to be future architects? Have any of you I
think it's their choice, right?
I always ask this of people whose parents are architects. I said, did you ever want to become an architect? And I think unscientific surveys, the majority say no. I think it's a very specific profession. And if you grew up in that household, I don't think you're something you want to pursue necessarily.
Yeah, but ironically enough, a lot of the people that I know who have parents that are both architects actually become architects themselves, even if they've seen the pain of what it is to be in the business. So that's... Yeah, but I mean, yes, Libo, I think altruistically, it is up to them. But I would be lying if I didn't say, my daughter is this incredible artist, and I hope she uses it for the most lucrative career that she can find. And I wouldn't necessarily count architects as among that.
Well,
Yeah.
maybe we can advance it. I mean, Fen, so if those of you listening on podcast, we're joined by Libo's baby, Fen. He's making his first appearance. But maybe we can advance it a few generations ahead and say, students who are in the studying right now, whether it's an undergrad or it's a master's degree, what are some of the things that they might be thinking about? What are some of the ways that they might approach the profession, knowing a lot of the things that we talked about and its limitations, but also interested in the possibilities of what a future architect can look like?
The crazy thing, Alex, is I don't actually think we have to wait. I've been really encouraged by what I'm seeing come out of even Gen Zs and the new grads and their crossover between architecture and architecture practice to them being very socially driven. So I feel like, and they're asking for things that honestly I wish I asked for while I was coming out of school, whether that's a work life and a home life, and it's like a distinct difference between the two. So I feel like in a way, if we want to retain that workforce, then we need to figure out our firm structure to hire that workforce. And the flip side of that is I think that they're also going to, if they can't find it, they might build it themselves, being practice in whatever new shape and form is coming. So I feel like the transition's already in a way actively happening. I also am kind of really enthusiastic about how interdisciplinary school programs are. Like architecture schools mixed in with gaming schools, mixed in with product schools, also with like business, and how much more I think reliant they're going to be on team-based businesses like going forward.
It's a perfect time to expand your network beyond the architecture school, to go to the other side of campus at the computer science lab or go to the business school and see what people are up to. Because I also find, I think an optimistic or a hopeful way of looking at it is I think there are a lot of people who are interested in what architecture is. They still think that it's an interesting profession. They still love buildings. They love public space. They want the physical world to be better. And I think that they're interested in actually interacting with these architects. And maybe if I were to synthesize what you're saying, Evelyn, it's also just like, go do it. You have the chance right now. There's opportunity. Don't be encumbered. Just let inspiration lead you.
Yeah, go do it. But I do think even deans of architecture schools are seeing, are talking to deans of other universities, and they're bringing that into the curriculum, right? So they're inviting students to take more electives outside of architecture schools. I mean, I honestly see that happening very naturally. Yeah, but there is still, the architecture school is still the lighthouse. People are still able to identify the architecture student from like across campus. And there's still, for better or for worse, kind of like this, I wouldn't say nostalgia for me, but I think for them, like a curiosity around like what happens in the architecture building, and what it is to be an architect.
Yeah, architecture is a beautiful profession because we've been borrowing a lot from other professions to do architecture traditionally. And I see this moment as an opportunity to actually use the knowledge that you got from architecture and apply it to other industries and see what happens. So in a way, architecture can be translated. Although you're not building buildings, like what we said throughout this podcast, I think the special ability for an architect is to communicate and be integrated and try to organize resources and people to build a product. So that's the specialty of the profession that I see.
Yeah, indeed. There's a lot that I think we can push forward. And I think that's probably why the four of us are also interested in talking about this stuff, because it tends to be that we sort of silo and there isn't a lot of opportunity besides like sitting around the water cooler and saying, oh man, that deadline was killer, or, this project didn't go through, or this or that. But I do hope that anybody who's listening out here takes some inspiration and says, well, if I have an idea, if I have something that I think I can provide value for the world, or if I don't have it yet, let me try to figure that out and then go out and implement it. I think there's still a lot of opportunity for that. I think it's good. It's a good moment to wrap up here and maybe just ask and end on our final question that we always ask our guest, Evelyn. So, the show is called Most Podern. Play on words. If you're in architecture school, you would definitely get it. But we like to ask our guests, how would they describe the era that we're in right now as it pertains to the built environment. And as someone who's constantly talking to practices and thinking about how architecture should move forward, and I guess eventually how those practices should shape the built environment, I'm really curious to hear what your take is.
I feel like we're at this inflection point, but I also feel like I've been saying that we've been at an inflection point for the last decade. But I think there's things happening outside of the world of architecture that's going to move it more, especially, and we didn't even talk about AI, but I think that has the ability to really change the way we work and what we deliver and the potential there. So you can look at it as like maybe we are in this inflection point. I would look at it as an opportunity to be in an era of reinvention. And again, I think our ability to grab onto that opportunity sooner rather than later is going to define is going to define how either we define architecture and architects and practice, or how many other people is going to define who we are and what we do.
That's wonderful. I mean, I think that means that we have a lot of agency right now, but we have to seize the moment. Well, with that, thank you so much, Evelyn, for joining us.
Where can people find you?
Where can people find me? I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. I'm trying to build out my other social channels, but I can only focus on one at a time. So the best place is to find me at LinkedIn. Yeah. And I have a lot of opinions there.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. We'll definitely search those opinions out online. Thank you for listening to this episode with Evelyn. Definitely check out her podcast, Practice Disrupted, and follow her thoughts on LinkedIn. If you enjoyed this episode and aren't yet subscribed, please consider subscribing on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Give us a like and help us establish more conversations like this, practitioners, thought leaders, and anybody shaping the built environment into the future.
Most Podern.
Most Podern.
Most Podern.
Most Podern. Most Podern 팟캐스트.